Good afternoon. Welcome. This is Conversations. It's kind of the first time that we've done it. We kind of did it last year with Greg and Ben. I think it was supposed to be some sort of debate. I think people were hoping for a steel cage match, possibly, but it turned out to be a really nice conversation. And then Margarita had planted the seed about, well, what if this was more of a regular event, and that it's a conversation with faculty members and there's a theme that we're speaking to. So we're going to try it today. So today, drawing. Dave, Hilary, and myself will be speaking about drawing in different ways. So with that said, Dave, let's do it.
Okay, we good? More or less? Okay. So I just want to open up a little bit and start the conversation about drawing. And I'm going to talk with you, well, each of us is going to talk about a particular person who handles drawing maybe a little bit differently than what you might expect, or at least I know I'm going to try to do that. So I want to preface that just for a second and try not to eat up our time, but I want to preface it with a bit of a formulation about drawing. And I think that there's at least 4 ways, if not many more ways, to think about drawing. And they all kind of fold into each other, but I'm going to parse them out, and maybe you can detect as we start to talk through these the kinds of differences you might be seeing in the people that we're talking about, and hopefully we show some of our own work as well. So the first thing, drawing to see, which in this situation it's basically observing, drawing what you see, recording, tracing, getting it up in your head. We're going to probably touch on drawing to know, which is about thinking, maybe diagramming. We're going to talk about drawing to specify, which in some ways is to define something. Like think construction drawing. You're defining and you're illustrating something very specific. What I'm going to start with is drawing to imagine. And that's what I love, the way I like to draw. I don't know about like, it's more of a bit of a passion. But it's a way of imagining something that's not there. It's speculation and it's a proposal. Sometimes they come to fruition, but a lot of times these things they just exist in a different place than if I'm making a drawing to produce a building, let's say. So let me get on with that. So I'm going to talk about Douglas Darden, who was an architecture faculty member back. He's been gone. He got a terminal illness fairly early in his life. I don't think he lived past, 40s, 38, something like that. And for part of the time he was drawing, he knew his number was up. So he knew he was going because it was a kind of long-term terminal illness. He taught at the University of Colorado. So he made these drawings, these really incredible drawings of buildings that were never built. These are all just projections and imaginations. And they're all in graphite and really dense, beautiful graphite, big drawings. And they're all located at, what is it, Columbia? Yeah, Columbia. They're now part of their archive. So I'm going to try to talk about his drawings a little bit and then maybe just show you a little bit of what influence it's had on the way I like to think about drawing. So these incredible drawings, which are, they're architectural drawings, and that's clearly a section, but the way this section is constructed is really remarkable, and we'll get to that, how these things came about. And the wonderful thing about this is these are not planned. They're constructed. They're made through a process of thinking through imagery and overlaying the imagery, and I'll show you here in a minute. And I like to think about his drawings as being a kind of challenge to architecture about what ought to be, not what is. So one of the things I want to kind of get after is the idea that these kinds of drawings are about architecture. They're talking about architecture. They're spoken to architecture in a way that nothing else will suffice. In other words, there's no other way to make this bit of expression that addresses architecture in a kind of unique and special way. And it's only through the means of drawing that this happens. Let's see if we can get to... The object of his game, if you will, not really a game, but his practice, was to sort of overload, just like overload your understanding of what a building is, or what architecture is, or what a drawing is for that matter. These are all acts of speculation. A lot of these drawings start with his reading of a story, like I'll tell you when we get there, but he'll read a Faulkner novel and then suddenly start a sequence of drawings that kind of are drawing off some narrative element in the book. So let's talk about the method. So he was really, I mean, these drawings were drawn prior to computers. So this is all hand-drawn, hand-assembled. And what he would do is he would go to texts from the 1800s, textbooks and line drawings of locomotives. And you can see a locomotive over there, a kind of New England church, a Native American house. And then what he would do is he would put those drawings on acetate. So he would draw that drawing. He would start off on tracing paper, and we'll talk about that in a second. But he would get these things into acetate, onto acetate, and then begin to overlay the images. And that's what you're seeing down in the lower right. And then the drawing that's generated is somewhat related, but not completely. But it's sort of, okay, with that form, I can draw this section. Here's another one. This is a house we'll talk about. This came from Faulkner's As I Lay Dying. It's part of a narrative of a person who dies, and you can see these images that are coming from old textbooks and old descriptive, and they're scaled and rescaled, and then they're overlaid into an image that then brings about a drawing. Hilary kindly found me some nice images of his tracings. And so these are actually the working through of the layers. And you can kind of see there's another good one here, where you can see there's an initial kind of construction of the drawing, and then it's finished in graphite. So there's a really intense process. You can see layers of trace stuck together, and then they sort of get more and more formalized, and then wind up and you can see, I think, yeah, they're removing the gentleman's body from the house. That's the ambulance picking him up, which is just like, it's kind of a weird, shocking way of thinking about architecture. This is a really wonderful sheet. And some of you out there kind of work this way. Some of my third-year students, who hopefully there's a few of you out there, maybe haven't discovered tracing paper yet, and it's actually kind of magical when you start to see what you can accomplish by laying things together and bringing things over on one another. Okay, so I'm going to go quickly now. Another person you might be interested in looking at their drawings is Alvaro Siza. He had a very interesting formulation. He said, you don't need drawing to make a building. All you got to do is go out and ham the stakes in, and you can just start. He says, but you do need drawing in order to make an architect. So it's a very interesting formulation, although I would contend that staking something out on the ground is a drawing. Okay, so I'm just going to show you quickly some of my drawings that are inspired in some way by Darden. I'm really interested in the atmosphere that graphite produces, and so I made a series of these. They're 50. I'm not going to show you 50, but I'll show these very quickly so we can, because I'm already eating up 12 minutes, like heartbeat. These are all done with rubbed graphite with tracing paper using as a mask. So there's nothing drawn or charcoal. This is all graphite and an eraser. And carving the paper with compass points. All these drawings start without me knowing how they're going to end. They're all improvisation. Every single one of them starts with just a few marks on the page or a piece of rubbing or something like that. And I have a kind of version of that in sketchbook form where color gets to come into play. But all of these are sort of improvisations, starting with just a few lines. So my short point here is just you can draw even when you don't know what you're going to wind up with. You can start and just start, make line, make another line, make another line, and keep it going. And if anybody ever wants to see how this is done, you come up and meet me on the 3rd floor one afternoon, and I'll show you a couple videos of, during the pandemic, I filmed a few drawings being made this way. Okay, so I'm going to finish with a quote from Michelangelo, and he's directing this quote at his assistant, Antonio. And the actual quote is, "Draw, Antonio, draw, and don't waste time." So anyway, that's how I'm going to finish, and I'll pass it on. There we go. I think you just keep clicking and it'll get in.
Okay. Can you guys hear me? Yeah? Okay. These are spreads from Auguste Choisy's sketchbooks over 20 years. All depict a view that is looking up. All 10 or so of Choisy's sketchbook spreads that exist today maintain a similar up view. Choisy, a historian, an archaeologist, a linguist, and a professor of architectural history and engineer, was a student at the École Polytechnique from 1861 to 1863. Following that, he became a student at the Ponts et Chaussées, which is the School of Bridges and Roads. So think like public works, which would include architecture. He was there for 3 years. And while he was a student there, students would go to school between November and May. And the rest of the year was dedicated to practical work. Those were called missions. And Choisy, who is really embraced and interested in antique archaeology and architecture, went on missions to study buildings in the Rhone district near Lyon in 1864, and in 1865, further south in France near the port of Marseille. And then he was lucky to be able to visit Greece, Holland, Belgium, and Athens, as well as Rome in 1866. So following his brief visits, his higher up, the Ministry of Public Works actually noticed Choisy's gift and sponsored Choisy for a 6-month scholarly expedition to Italy. During his mission in 1867, he studied the Bridge of Augustus in Narni, Italy. The Bridge of Augustus, built around 27 BCE, was a Roman viaduct near the Italian city of Narni and over the river Nera in Umbria district. And it was built to carry the Flavian Way, which was the road from Rome to Rimini. Of the original 4 spans of the 160-meter-long bridge, only the southernmost pier remains standing, or span remains standing. Choisy's drawings do not portray the bridge in a typical way, which would include picturesque ruins, reconstructions of its likeness, or the new technique of photography. Rather, Choisy's upview allowed him to take note of the unique assembly of one of its piers, specifically the ribbed vault construction. Choisy meticulously documented the construction of Pier A in his sketchbook. The sketch details on the right spread comprise 5 views, 2 elevations and 3 oblique aspects. While the upper right-hand drawing in elevation notes the inner core of beton, or concrete, the focus on the spread seems to lie in the relation of the discrete stones to the overall composition of the whole. The individual travertine blocks are measured, carefully positioned within the assembly and shown rising into an arc. The stacked stone is seen from below, as undoubtedly seen by Choisy from the ground. Written on the underside of the enlarged detailing in the lower right corner is the word dessous, meaning underneath. Here we see the tectonic origins of the worm's eye view, the material structure of the architecture delineating the space occupied by man below. Choisy's translation from sketch to drawing revealed another critical act, synthesis and distillation. On the left, the compiled sketches essentially revolve around the springing of the arch, collecting views in a 180-degree rotation around the pier supporting the arch. In the drawing, the views of the pier coalesce into one pictorial oblique projection, plus a diagram superimposing horizontal structures of the rib vaulting. This kind of clean extraction of the technical core will come to define Choisy's future work. The most uniform graphic device in the plates of the L'Art de bâtir chez les Romains and its successor, the L'Art de bâtir chez les Byzantins, is the use of the worm's eye view parallel projection. In Choisy's sketches, we saw the relationship between his constructive logic and the worm's eye view. The observer inhabits the space under the vaults of the Roman engineers. The structure builds from the earth to the sky to delimit architectural space. The up view is phenomenally paramount. In the Romance, the up view is applied into all forms of parallel projection, isometric, dimetric, and trimetric, as well as oblique projections from the plan and the elevation. There appears to be no immediate system. Choisy adjusted each viewing angle so that each best expressed the tectonic space to the observer. Choisy's first step in drawing was establishing the directions of the projections of the axes, fundamentally positing the subjective positions of the viewing angle relative to the observer. Consequently, the relative reductions of the scales of each inclined axis are determined via projection. The resultant representation is of true measure in space. Juxtaposing these axial lines of infinite space to the essential tectonic core also advances the conceptualization of a progressing constructive extension into 3-dimensional space. Furthermore, to aid comparative study, all the graphic plates in the Romance and the Byzantine are presented at a uniform scale of reduction. The ideal realm of the structure of the past is scaled in part by Choisy's use of construction lines. The latent rational structure of the remnants of the past is delimited and extrapolated with graphic tracings. These lines variously abstract geometric, material, graphic, quantitative information, but they're also instrumental constructive elements to the drawing. The found remnant is largely dissected in a clean, pure manner. Sectional cuts are typically blank voids, delineated by hard edge lines. At times, the rendered material surface wraps into the section plane, yet the material element, typically brick, is distilled to its outline. The graphic extension of the material is always partial, but each material element is always maintained by its standard dimension. Shadow lines banish ambiguity and embody qualitative space within the orthogonal constructs. Other lines, sometimes dashed, extend into space to render an outline of a complete tectonic structure. The materially ruptured vaults of the Palatine Hill and the Baths of Caracalla are completed through delicate trajectory lines connecting across the spatial gap. These traces geometrically conceptualize the determinate growth of the particular constructive processes. Still, other lines circumscribe the pure circular geometries ordering many of the vaulted forms. The drawn and traced boundaries of the artifact are determined by the necessary structure. The essence of the system exposes each building's pure core. The isolated ideal assemblage is posited in a white field for inspection. Choisy individualizes the graphic technique to overtly reveal the varied complex of constructive scales in the tectonic fundament. Individual material elements, combinatory systems, structured assemblages, and functional arrangement, a material element is an ideal unit. A tile or a brick is always drawn as a complete constructive part, even when the rendered material surfaces are delaminated. The accentuation of the essential material constituent is also manifest through selective spatial protrusions. Curiously, in some drawings, Choisy depicts trees sprouting from the tectonic spatial assembly. He is clearly juxtaposing the purified assembly to its ruined present-day presence. Such drawings engage the poles of the real and the fictitious, the rational and the irrational. Choisy stimulates spatio-tectonic imagination, The drawing creates a carefully crafted imaginative world of architecture from the architectural ruin, grounding the drawings in the actions of retrospection and projection. After the 1883 publication of the L'Art de bâtir chez les Byzantins, a great part of Choisy's research efforts were devoted to the development and production of the Histoire de l'Architecture. He taught a history of architecture course at the Ponce-et-Chaussée for about 25 years, and his Histoire is a compilation of his teaching material. Choisy's sketches from 1885 reveal the structure of his evolution in his use of parallel projection from the Byzantine to the Histoire. His travels that year are represented by sketches of Romanesque churches. There are noticeable differences between their sketched representations. The sketch from Neve is raw, that's the one on the left, but both the textual and graphical notations are smudged by an error and reflect a correction. The line work on the sketch is loose, perhaps even inaccurate. This might be due to haste, uncertainty, or technique. The viewpoint is from below. The view conveyed is of the apparent scene, like that of the visitor standing in the nave and perhaps sitting at a pew and looking up. This sketch shows an on-site impression. The other sketchbook spread on the right from 1885 contains a study of Saint-Savin on the left page and Poitiers on the right facing page. Both sketches approximate canonical isometrics. Furthermore, they are both up views, like the sketch from Neve. Unlike Neve, the viewpoint is more analytical. It moves below the horizon line, and the constructive elements are suspended in space. Under this aspect, these two sketches of Saint-Savin and Poitiers are unique. There are no other extant sketches that so closely correspond to their future final composition as ultimately published in the Histoire 14 years later. One can easily speculate that these juxtaposed sketches formed a prototype or a link between the Romance and Choisy's proposed and ultimate comparative format for the Histoire. Between the sketch and the illustrations, the chronological adjacency, viewing angle, and level of detail remained virtually unchanged. Most notably, the form of parallel projection has changed from isometric axonometric to oblique projection. One can reasonably draw the conclusion that Choisy's transition from axonometric to oblique projection in this case is fully intentional. Other up-view sketches were similarly translated into oblique projections from the plan for the Histoire de l'Architecture. In the Histoire, we can see an abstractive system tuned to comparative ends and grounded by the oblique plan's worm's eye view. As well, the sections are controlled and specialized relative to revealing the different aspects of tectonic organization systems. Oblique projections in the Greek, Romanesque, and Gothic chapters read as an evolutionary sequence. Depth is confined and defined by the module of the bay in the Romanesque and Gothic churches. All three reveal spatial organization, which is contingent upon the respective structural system, which is reflective of the cultural historical system. The central nave soars and the supports of the cross-vaulted structure flanking each side of the Romanesque and Gothic churches is evident. The plans are also sectioned to establish fundamental hierarchies in form and structure. The Romanesque and Gothic church plans are variably cut through into the central nave, communicating the primacy of this volume. The secondary volumes, the side aisles, are closed by crosshair lines reflecting the module. Likewise, Greek cella drawings are similarly cut to reveal the actual spatial connection between earth and sky. The sectioning reveals the central tectonic character of the architectural space of each epoch. For Choisy, dissection and abstraction became an intellectual method of discursive thought as a means of hypothesis. The deconstruction indicated construction. The purification of parts, elements, modules, proportions, hierarchies, bays, and systems indicates a reverse process, one of building. Thus, Choisy defined the general trend of separating the real from the imaginative. Choisy uses the synthetic simultaneity of the plan-based worm's eye view oblique projection symbolically to represent building in addition to buildings. Saint-Sauvy de Constantinople was upheld by Choisy as the pinnacle of domed Byzantine construction, exhibiting the ultimate in architectural unity via the harmonic effects of the structural mise en scène. This stance is echoed by Corbusier, who appropriated Choisy's drawing and appended the caption, quote, "The plan is active in all the structure. Its geometric laws and their modular combinations develop themselves in all parts," end quote. Choisy described the poetry of the structure of the central dome that was isolated by illumination, quote, "as suspended in space," end quote. The axonometric projection in this case shows a free-floating volume detached from the ground plane. The building in space and the space of the building are animated via the worm's eye view isometric. The skewed aspect of the plan, unlike the regularity of the oblique plan, aids in imparting an animated sense. The axonometric models the spatial reality of the building and engages man's synthetic perception of it. Choisy optimized the nature of axonometric space to develop representations of architecture that straddle this dynamic modern realm. The worm's eye view was the critical component to evince the spatio-tectonic simultaneity of architectural phenomena. Choisy's influence with the up view has spanned the last 150 years. Here's a drawing by Stan Allen, which probably will surprise faculty, but maybe not students, who worked for Raphael Moneo and made this drawing in 1984, I think, yeah. Stan Allen observes that, reflects on making this drawing by saying the worm's eye view, with clear reference to Choisy, accentuates the relationship between plan and structure. By definition, a worm's eye must be cut at plan level, and the logic of the structure as it develops upward is clearly explained. What the worm's eye viewpoint does better than almost any other form of representation is describe the spatial experience of a three-dimensional enclosure. While the plan anticipates movement, structure and spatial organization and spatial organization, the section maps out profile and scale. It is fundamentally the plane of the ceiling, domes, vaults, skylights that condition our experience of space. The first thing anyone does on entering an expansive space is look up. The worm's eye allows the architect to study and describe the enclosing effect of the architecture overhead, end quote. We see perhaps more influence of Choisy's, Choisy and the Histoire's graphic approach. Here, by example, is James Serling utilizing both oblique and axonometric up views to communicate different ways of understanding a proposed design for the Nordrhein-Westphalian Museum. The oblique is utilized to communicate the pure geometric plan of the circle and the square. The axon, on the other hand, not an isometric, but a dimetric, so that the diagonal columns aren't superimposed, better conveys the space within those geometric volumes. And that's it. Patrick.
Okay, drawing from Judd, AKA through drawing, how does a knuckle-headed architect learn from an artist and learn from a building? This is Donald Judd. He was an American artist. He was born 1928, passed away in 1994. He, over a lifetime, Judd constructed a body of work grounded in his firm, unrelenting principle that space is made. From his early paintings, as you can see in the background, to his larger constructed installations that he would call specific objects, be it the 100 aluminum boxes or the concrete boxes, both out at the Chinati Foundation. He sought to define space. Space was elemental, and he sought clarity in it. He didn't look for metaphor, analogy. The thing is the thing. Also, art, architecture, and landscape was a shared experience. It was inseparable to Judd. So in his architecture work, he brought together living and artwork together in relationship to the landscape. His interest also folded into making furniture. So his furniture was inspired by his work. Again, very elemental, had a high degree of clarity to it. In search of what we could say spatial solace, Judd finally landed in Marfa, Texas. For those who don't know where Marfa is, here's the great state of Texas. You have Marfa out in West Texas. It's only 600 miles from Houston, 500 miles from Dallas. It's way out there, but it's quite a pilgrimage. It's an amazing trip to take if you're going to go out there. He arrived in Marfa, early 1970s, began to buy houses, grocery stores, abandoned buildings, and eventually a military base. D.A. Russell. It was an abandoned military base that had been used in World War II, but had since then just sat abandoned. All these spaces he bought, he lived in them, he worked in them, and they became places where he would permanently install his work. The Chinati Foundation is what he founded. He has, and that's where you saw those aluminum boxes, the concrete boxes, they're out there as well. Now, my story kind of begins here. Now, if you look right here, there are two little buildings. I was visiting the Chinati Foundation, and the docent was touring us around, and just by happenstance mentioned that there were two concrete buildings that Judd had designed that were unfinished. Well, they got my attention, concrete and unfinished. I go, well, why can't I see these? But they weren't they weren't accessible to the public. So, upon my return, I went in search of the concrete buildings. Took a deep dive, found every book I could, and the only mention of Donald Judd's architecture concrete buildings was in the Architectura, a catalog of Donald Judd's architecture work and furniture work. Really, really wonderful book. So in there, I found two spreads, two images, and then a really beautiful constructed drawing, and then two rather crude sketches by Donald Judd, and then a description of the buildings. So, a few things about these drawings real quick. To the left, these drawings were constructed, oh, why is it showing that? Sorry. By Loretta Vincarelli, Claude Armstrong, and Donna Cohen. They were collaborators with Judd for about 10 years. So they constructed these drawings. To the right is a drawing by Donald Judd. It's crude, it's rough, perhaps drawn with a burnt stick. He wasn't very interested in trying to make something precise. He was more about getting the idea out. Sketching was just a matter of fact. How do I get the idea out? And if you look, you can see how he made those arcs. Scott Gardner pointed this out to me, and it just didn't really dawn on me. The lines are all constructed, but those arcs, they're done by hand. So it's really kind of crude way of drawing, but he's trying to get the idea out, as opposed to the beautiful drawing to the side. So I bought a sketchbook and I started drawing because I was trying to figure out more about these buildings. So perhaps maybe from a constructive point of view, I started to draw out sections, started to try to think about the forces, trying to think about how this building was put together and the spatial consequences. In addition to kind of reading about Judd and his work, I started to draw his artwork, trying to find some sort of relationship between construction, between materials, and between forms. So the sketchbook was a work in progress. Then I started to think about it sequentially. Started to lay it out and say, okay, I discovered that there's two types of concrete construction that he used for the buildings. There's concrete tilt wall, which the walls are cast horizontally, tilted in place, and then there's the cast in place concrete vault that ties it all together. So just trying to think about it sequentially, how it goes together. Having not visited or seen the building, but just guessing. Then I put together a set of as-builts, a set of drawings that just basically laid out, this is what I know about the building. I know plan, I know section, I know elevation, from what I could glean from the drawings that I had found. And more specifically, I was looking at the, how did he construct the arc? What's the relationship of the arc or the vault to the body of the building? And I prepared these drawings because I had contacted the Chinati Foundation, said I got to come touch the buildings, I got to come measure the buildings, can I do it? They said yes. So these drawings were prepared so that I could go out and kind of test what I drew and what I think I know versus what was actually constructed. My last drawing before I left was doing this 0-90, basically trying to pull the building apart and see the individual pieces and start to see the relationship of floor to wall to roof. More importantly, the drawing where I started to overlay the three different building types that would have comprised the larger complex. So the elevation is the one of the two buildings that was completed, but then there was two other ones, so I kind of superimposed those sections on top to try to find some sort of kind of relationship of those two, or of those three buildings. Then I went out there. So Meredith and I hopped in the car and drove 2,000 miles to Marfa to see the buildings. What's interesting about these buildings is you can see there's piles of lumber down at the bottom. There's also stacks of rebar, piles of gravel and sand. At this time, the buildings, they were started in 1988 and they were stopped in 1989. So I'm out there in 2009, 20 years later, and it looks as if they had just stopped construction. It was a very surreal, kind of eerie experience to be out there. So I started to look at both buildings and make some red lines and mark up kind of what I was starting to discover. What I found interesting with this is the corner. We're talking about turning a corner and how you put the building together. These two corners, where all the corners are basically bolted together. Never in a million years would I have thought that. And that was a huge surprise to me, that the buildings are bolted, or the walls are bolted together. Also, what I found, when I was looking at the drawings, it looked like everything was planar. Everything was in the same plane. But this wall right here was pushed in 1 inch. I'm not exactly sure why it's 1 inch, but I thought it was interesting. By pulling that wall in, it started to emphasize the section, the wall and the roof assembly, so it started to emphasize the section. Also, the overhang extended out 1 inch. I'm not sure why, possibly for a gutter, I'm not sure. But it was interesting to say, okay, here's what I've drawn, here's what I can find out, and then what the actual constructed reality started to reveal. Also, if you notice, you see the lines that are happening in the wall. That's when they cast the wall, they cast it on, and I'll show you in a second, they cast it on top of a platform, and they had form liner lined and cast on top of that. So you read the registration of the lines of the formwork in there as well. Certainly not planned by Judd at all. You don't see that in the drawings of how it comes together, but when you're out there, that constructive reality starts to become impactful. The other building was partially constructed, and what I found beautiful was how they constructed those vaults. I mean, talk about something kind of primitive, but it's so beautiful. So they would build or they construct the concrete vaults in sections. So they'd cast it, then they'd move it over, and they'd cast it again. And the formwork was still remaining and is still there. Also, the rebar that extends up outside of the wall, they would bend that rebar. I don't know how they would bend the rebar, but they'd bend it and tie it to the rebar of the concrete roof, and then they would cast it. So that's how they would make that joint. That's the casting bed that's out there, and you can see remnants of the form liner off to the side. So they would cast the walls on top, pick it up, and set it in place. So for me, going out there, having drawn it, having inhabited it through drawing it first, and then going out and seeing it, it was kind of a surprise for me in a couple of different ways. Is it a construction site? Is it a ruin? Is it finished? I don't know. That was kind of the shades of gray. Also, when you look at it, when you look at Judd's work, so if you were to walk over and you would go into the artillery shed and look at those beautiful aluminum boxes, those things are crafted, they are precise. When you walk around and you touch that building, you look at it, it is rough. I mean, this is a very complex building that he's trying to put together with concrete, and it's like a couple of guys in a concrete mixer trying to to cast the concrete. And it's beautiful and if it's in its rough state, but for Judd, I can understand why they were probably stopped because of the craft. So I got back and I started to draw and draw a little differently. So I drew the wall and I was thinking about, well, the formwork, the ties, the holes that were cast to bolt it together. And I started to think about his prints and the lines and the complexity of his prints, and just thinking about the relationship to the actual kind of constructed wall. Then I started to lay it out and started to look at the floor in relationship to the walls, in relationship to the roof, and the joints that happen between the walls. With concrete tilt wall, you tilt the wall up, and there's a 3/4 inch joint that happens there. I'm not sure how Judd was going to fill it, but it was really beautiful because you could see light through there. You could see the sky through there. Then I started to think, well, you know, just looking solely at the surface, so doing a graphite wash, thinking about the concrete surface, and, you know, something similar to installation Judd did, where it's a series of milled pieces of aluminum that he lined the wall with. And then finally, looking at the redrawing the buildings, but just drawing the bones of the building. Think about them as unfinished. So the these were the 3 different types of buildings that were going to go out there. The one in the middle is representative of the 2 that were constructed. Redrawing the elevations, but starting to kind of draw in the formwork, or where the form panels were, the bolt openings, and then started to combine them. This is how he would have, you know, if the complex was realized, how it would look. So trying to kind of situate those out, or put those together to see the reading of the complex. And then finally, the last drawing, another one cutting a section through there, trying to capture kind of the shadow that the space would create, the volume that would be captured inside of the room in relationship to the sky. And that is it. So, do we have I guess part of it would be, do you have any questions, or do we ourselves have any questions to ask? Oh, well, I'm glad you're comfy.
These drawings are, you know, in some ways, I'm sorry. So, Patrick, have you ever been approached to publish these drawings? Because it would seem like it would add to the understanding of something in his work.
No, I should probably be more proactive in trying to do that.
Because it's really interesting, because it's you know, this thing that never gets finished, but now it has this other life in these drawings, which is pretty interesting.
No, I think that was part of it, is how do you, through drawing, how do you inhabit something? You know, I mean, we ask you all, we say, okay, the building analysis. We ask you to draw a building, to look at a building, but how do you do that, you know? I mean, how do you kind of take a deep dive and get into it and ask the questions and redraw it over and over and over again to try to understand it? I mean, that's kind of what this is, and that's what Dave's was about with Darden and his own work. How do you inhabit that? Or with Hilary, you know, looking up. I had never thought about that before, but we're looking at a ceiling. How many times do we draw ceilings? How many times do we really appreciate a good ceiling? And that's what was so fascinating about that.
You know, it's funny. 3 years ago, we did I don't know who was doing it. Me and Sharon. Yeah, Sharon and someone else. Was it Margarita? The second year competition. So, I mean, I came up with something that, because of the looking up thing, so looking up, dentist office. Why are the ceilings of the dentist office so bad? And it was thinking that you guys all got a dental clinic for your second year competition, when I think it might have been this fifth year group, is just that question about thinking about that overhead plane and seeing it and making it really be part of the architecture, that you're contemplating it and the totality of the enclosure of the space is contemplated.
Yes. Yeah.
How many of you, when you're watching the up view drawing, thought to yourself, I'm going to make one of those of my project? Yeah, there you go. That's it. Our work is done here.
I like those odds. Does anybody have a question? Yes.
So Patrick, I'm curious. Every time you draw the knowledge of construction, it seems like you make the structure itself relatively small.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting point. I think as I got more into it, the question of place came into it. And when you go out to Marfa, I mean, it is expansive. And part of it was trying to capture a sense of the space in which the building was situated. I think that was probably why. Yeah, I mean, they're kind of smaller drawings, and the sky is big, but that's part of the place. And I think that's part of the beauty of those buildings, is how they're kind of situated in relationship to the larger expanse. That kind of solace that Judd was seeking is so trying to capture that in the drawing. Greg.
Do you have any thoughts on how he poured the concrete roof shells, concrete all this stuff put down on the side?
Well, I think at the end, let's see here.
Like there was a lot of steel in it.
Well, there's they won't let you go in it because they're afraid it's going to fall down. Well, the thing's been up for 40 years and hasn't moved, so I don't think it's going to fall down. So I think at the end, they probably had some piece of formwork that they kind of built up around the edges to cast the concrete against. It's when you really look at that roof, it's kind of wavy, so I'm not exactly sure how stiff of a mix they had to use to keep it from all just dumping over the side. Frank Weiner.
Patrick, how are you?
I'm well, thank you.
The three of you make a beautiful book about drawing. You don't just have to ask Patrick to help you. That would be a really nice book. Because the 3 points of view relate and are also very different. Hilary, I have one question. One or two of the quasi drawings seem to oscillate before my eyes, like an optical illusion. Can you understand why that phenomenon happens? In other words, the same drawing, I felt like was looking up and down.
It's the parallel projection, right? That it is, the inverse is always possible with seeing it because you don't ground it. And technically, you probably shouldn't poche or use shadow on a parallel projection, because really a parallel projection doesn't exist in the world you and I inhabit. But it helps render it in such a sense that you actually can ground yourself somewhat. But that reversibility, some people purposely play off of too. And so I think that the manipulation of the drawing type affords it to be super abstract, but also perhaps more grounded, as you see, I think probably in the earlier parallel projections are more unique and more explicit. And then it becomes much more sort of a graphic system in the histoire.
So, Dave and conversation, you focused more on how that work influenced other people. So how did it influence you?
I mean, it's a more academic pursuit at one level, right? That it forms the basis of my doctoral research, which I don't really talk about much or have people read. But I feel really lucky that I fell upon Schwazi. Joseph Rickert recommended me to look at his work. And for me, he has posited something that's become really meaningful in terms of being a teacher, which is, you know, how often do you find a historical topic that is grounded in the acts we do that are creatively expressive? And so in understanding better that way of drawing, I am really good at thinking and making and talking about drawing and thinking about drawing as a means of communication and a way of both being inventive as well as descriptive. And so for me, there's just great personal value in being able to be both a designer drawer and a historian researcher. And Schwazi is something that allowed me to straddle those two halves of, you know, being both a designer and an academic. So I think it's not so easy. It's much more complicated. And frankly, I don't know. These guys are brave. I wouldn't share my drawings with you guys. I know you always want to see them, but you don't get to.
Yes.
Question for Dave. So, in your experience with drawing, you're talking about how you just have these moments where you just start putting lines on a page in no seemingly set up or orderly way, and then you get to some sort of finished thing at the end of it. So I'm wondering, when is it that you pick that one spot? Like, because I sometimes find myself in the same situation where I just start making a drawing of something, but I want to pick a spot. Like, when does that thought come to you? And then is it about making the drawing relate to the rest of it, or is it you just start making something once you pick this?
I usually start with a line. I spent I spent a lot of summers drawing the landscape around here because I was kind of from a flat state before I came here, and the rolling ground fascinated me. So the idea that the rolling ground could be expressed as a line. So just about every drawing that you saw there usually starts with a line of some sort, and it's kind of random. I say random. It's practiced, but it's because actually the problem is they become so practiced that it's difficult to do something else. So that's something I've found in each of these drawings. I mean, I've got hundreds of these darn things, and they all have the same vibe. So those charcoal drawings were an excuse to get away from the ink drawings that you saw towards the end. So starting is the only thing that's what I would call random. Everything else is a sort of choice of what to do next with the line that's already there. So it's a little bit, the line is there, and then you say, okay, here's another line that complements or starts to create something. And sometimes it creates a building-like thing. Other times it's just a landscape or a kind of a rolling ground, I guess is what.
So here's a question. Stan Allen, when he was talking about Raphael Moneo and making the drawing for Moneo, brought up this really, and actually if you guys want to read about it, if you go to the website Drawing Matter or Drawing Matters, you can just type in Stan Allen and you can read about that drawing. It's a wonderful website, by the way. He mentioned knowing when to stop. And, you know, like Schwazi is almost always taking away, right? And so it's sort of interesting when you're aggregating a drawing, how do you know when to stop?
You know what's really weird? I think I mentioned it. I made some, during the pandemic, made some YouTube videos, like 6 of them online. And then I stopped. I lost interest. But oddly enough, every one of those YouTube videos is about 20 minutes. And I never planned where the end point is, but I must get tired of it at 20 minutes, which is really odd. And I didn't discover that until I was like, wait a minute, all these videos are 20, 21 minutes, 22.
So the answer is stop at 20 minutes.
Because there is a time when you go, okay, that's just too much. It's so overdone that it's too much. You know?
Kevin.
Speak a little about the role of the hunch or intuition in the sense. I think all three of you, there's a hunch is probably enough.
I'm going to say, honestly, I'm a asking why person and looking person. I think Schwazi had to have been. I mean, actually, I didn't even talk about it, but he made a discovery at the Acropolis, which preceded his work in Rome. That was, he published his first academic paper while he was still a student, 24 years old. And it still is discussed as being a remarkable discovery about the curvature of the stylobate up at the Parthenon. How many people had studied the Parthenon? And this little French guy comes walking up, measuring things and saying, I wonder why that's like that. And then pursuing it beyond just the, isn't that interesting, right? So I'd say the pursuit of looking deeply and asking why. I mean, and so I do the same thing with Schwazi. Why is that like that? And saying, okay, what else can I find out that connects that thing to that thing? You know, and everyone else is doing the same thing. So I think it's a restless curiosity and a pursuit of really not just saying, isn't that interesting, but why, what's going on there? That would be my take on it.
Yeah, I think for me, it was just, I was curious about the buildings and wanted to know more about it, and I just started drawing. You know, from what little information I could find, I said, well, I just got to figure this out. And through drawing, started to kind of speculate and open up another world. So just drawing the line.
Yeah, I can sort of, I just saw the Darden drawings at an exhibition, and I was shocked by how beautiful, heavy, dark drafted lines could be. I mean, just, it was almost like he was gouging at the paper. It was unbelievable when you see him in the flesh or in the paper. That was a shock to me, and I was always excited about that, and I never could figure out how do you draw like that? How do you think like that? And it wasn't until later when I started to learn about how the drawings are constructed, that becomes very much more, you know, the interest in having something that's invented rather than a kind of, you know, I'm planning for a dentist or whatever thing, you know. To me, that was really exciting, that architectural ideas could be expressed that way, but not have to result in an outcome. And that's obviously both an advantage and a disadvantage, right? You can't really build some of these things, even though you'd like to see that, but how? So I think that's where my hunch would be located.
I'd also like to say that hunch makes something sound really brief and passing. And I would probably say to study any of the things that we showed today is, I mean, a really long, patient search in a way of continuing to grapple with the thing. It took me a year, maybe 2 years, to figure out parallel projection. I don't mean making the drawings, even conceptually trying to understand the difference between oblique and axonometric projection because the nomenclature is so screwy. And it's still a mess, and it's a mess in different languages. You encounter it in Italian, French, English, British English. It's all referred to differently. The only way to really know what anyone's talking about is to see the drawings. And then, in a way, I am proposing a representational way of understanding a differentiation between oblique projection and axonometric projection that is, I would argue, a contribution to knowledge relative to parallel projection in the world. Your question.
So what is the difference between an oblique and an
So if you, I mean,
Buckle
if you
up.
look at mathematically and algebraically, you can totally make them be the same thing. But we're talking about architectural representation, and we're talking about drawings, not, a formula. There's something called a polka theorem, which says that they're all the same, but they're not the same. So the oblique projection, I don't know if we want to go back. Just go to the very last slide that has the 2 images from Sterling, because you've got an oblique and an axon. Yeah, no, that one. So if you look at it, so on the left, the oblique projection maintains 2-dimensional spatial purity in either the plan or the elevation. More often than not, we see it in the plan, and when you guys are drawing, you use usually a plan oblique. You've got your pure plan, right? Squares are squares, circles are circles, and you pull it up to give yourself some kind of spatial reading because you're probably designing. The axonometric is truly 3-dimensional in space. And so if you go back to Frank's question, more than likely we could go back and look at what he was talking about, but my guess would be that the isometric, iso meaning equal, which means that the axes are rotated equally in space, are probably some of the most, well, they're purely extensive 3-dimensionally in all axes, and they may be the most prone to have reversibility because of that equality in space.
Any other? All right, well, thank you all very much. Appreciate it.